Good morning. I must say, thank you all for coming. I am stunned to see so many people. Please tell me you were either paid or get credit for being here. So I'll tell you what, when I was in college, I wouldn't have come. I'd have been outside in the sun. I want to thank the Foley Institute for having me here. It's really fun. I must admit, I have not been to Pullman since I was in college. But it's a beautiful place, and it's like a lot of fun, and I got to have a fun lunch and meet Heather Foley and other luminaries from your university, and it was a neat thing to get to do. I'll tell you what, though, I reckon if Tom Foley was still Speaker of the House, this country would be in better shape than it is. That's for sure. A couple of things. The first is that the ideas that I'm going to express in this talk are not just mine, but are the consequence of a collaboration between me and mostly a guy named Eric Beinhocker, who is a global luminary in the world of sort of new ways of thinking about economics. He runs something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford University, very important center. And behind him is a constellation of some of the smartest people on planet Earth, the Santa Fe Institute and other places. And I just want to be sure that at least if you don't like the ideas that I'm going to share, you blame them equally with me. If you do, then you can forget I said anything and just give it all the credit to me. But there is a multitude of people who have contributed to this set of ideas I'm going to share with you today. I wanted to write, and I know you wanted to hear, a speech filled with funny, ribald stories and dirty jokes and so on and so forth. I regret that that's not what we're going to have today. It's sort of a wonky talk, so you're going to have to stick with me. In any case, I want to start by saying that I believe that the principal lesson of the 20th century was that capitalism works and communism and socialism do not. There is simply no question in my mind that market capitalism has yielded massive increases in human prosperity, particularly in the West, but also while lifting hundreds of millions from poverty around the world. Yet despite these historic accomplishments, it is obvious that something is very wrong with how the system is performing today. The financial crisis of 2008, the stagnation of the middle class, rising economic inequality, global warming, these are all challenging our most deeply held beliefs about how a fair and well-functioning society should be organized. Even Wall Street is beginning to take notice. In the last few weeks, both Standard & Poor's and Morgan Stanley have issued reports warning investors that rising inequality is holding back economic growth. And this year, in his groundbreaking book, Capital in the 21st Century, French economist Thomas Piketty makes an extraordinarily convincing argument that left unmanaged, slow growth and rising inequality are inherent norms for capitalist economies. But no free and open society can sustain endlessly rising inequality for long. There is no example in human history. You show me a highly unequal society, and eventually I will show you either a police state or a revolution. There are no counterexamples. So the question is, has capitalism finally run its course? Will Karl Marx ultimately be proven right that capitalism produces, above all and in the end, are its own gravediggers? I don't believe this is inevitable. In fact, I believe that when well managed, capitalism is the greatest social technology ever invented to both create and distribute prosperity in human societies. Where we have gone wrong is in misidentifying how and why capitalism works. And it is this fundamental misunderstanding that has fostered the policies that have led directly to our current crisis of economic inequality and to the broader dissatisfaction people have with the economy in our country and around the world. Our economic challenge isn't fundamentally inequality per se. Our challenge is to explain what prosperity is and where growth comes from. For the economic inequality that we experience today is a symptom, not the disease, a consequence of the explanations we have been using to answer these questions. The challenge for the 21st century and the purpose of my talk today is to show that the existing explanation we have for what prosperity is and where growth comes from is wrong. and to point to a way to better and more effectively explain in a common sense way where these things come from. An emerging new paradigm based on empirical research rather than a century-old theory understands that capitalism's true genius is expressed not in efficiently allocating existing resources, but in effectively creating new solutions to human problems. And this new paradigm recognizes that broad-based economic inclusion isn't a moral imperative if and when we have growth. It is the principal mechanism that creates growth in capitalist economies. We do not need a new economic system. What we need is a better understanding of how and why capitalism works. By analogy, our ancestors knew that the stars and planets moved in the sky. But it wasn't until Copernicus showed that the sun and not the Earth was at the center of the solar system that we finally had a valid explanation for how and why they move. Likewise, now, after 40 years of stagnant wages and rising inequality, it is time to replace our old economic theories with better and more modern ones. For it is only through a deeper 21st century understanding of our capitalist system that we can hope to improve it. To save capitalism, we must redefine it. And to redefine capitalism, we must first understand where the old definitions went wrong. For the past century, the dominant economic paradigm has painted a narrow and mechanistic view of how capitalism works, focusing on the role of markets and prices in the efficient allocation of resources. The story is familiar. Rational, self-interested firms maximize profits. Rational, self-interested consumers maximize their utility. The decisions of these rational actors drive supply to equal demand. Prices are set, the market clears, and resources are allocated in a socially optimal way. From this theory, we've derived the trickle-down policy framework that now dominates thinking on both the left and the right. Markets are perfectly efficient, and anything that interferes with the so-called free market interferes with this efficiency and is bad. The rich are job creators. The more money and profits they have, the more jobs they create. Anything that impedes this, either through taxation or regulation, is by definition stupid and bad. In this view, rising inequality, crucially, is a feature of prosperity. It's how we know things are getting better. If the rich get richer, that's good for the economy. If the poor get richer, that's bad for the economy. You know the drill. It's a beautiful theory, a mechanized view befitting the mechanized industrial era from which it sprang. It is almost Newtonian in its elegant simplicity, and its practitioners and believers would like us all to think that the theory's principles, like when wages go up, employment goes down, have the force and validity of physical laws of nature. But over the past several decades, most of the bedrock assumptions of neoclassical economics have begun to unravel. Behavioral economists have accumulated a mountain of evidence to showing that real human beings don't actually behave all that rationally. Empirical economists have identified anomalies suggesting that financial markets aren't efficient at all. Experimental economists have raised problematic questions about the very existence of utility, the device economists have long relied on to prove that markets maximize social welfare. These observations lead thoughtful observers to the conclusion that markets are not characterized by immutable physical laws like force equals mass times acceleration, but rather they're constructed of social and moral laws like bedtime is 9 p.m. So humans aren't rational, markets aren't inherently efficient, and there may actually be no such thing as utility. No wonder the macroeconomic models built on these neoclassical ideas crashed and burned during the crisis of 2008. Conventional theory holds that the economy views the economy as a sort of rocking horse that, when perturbed by an outside force, sways for a while before predictably settling back to equilibrium. But as Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, has pointed out, what we saw in 2008 was more like a stampede of wild horses. Something spooks one of them, it kicks another horse, and pretty soon the whole herd is running wildly in a pattern of complex, dynamic behavior. The rocking horse paradigm of neoclassical economics didn't hold up. Market economies aren't simply mechanistic and predictable in the way that that theory describes. But over the last 30 years or so, a revolution has taken place in our understanding, in our scientific and mathematical understanding of the systemic nature of the world we inhabit. We went from thinking of human social systems as linear equilibrium systems to what we now call nonlinear, non-equilibrium, complex systems. This new view holds that the economy is a constantly evolving, interacting network of highly diverse households, firms, banks, regulators, and other agents, much more like Haldane's wild herd than the conventional neoclassical rocking horse. Complex, dynamic, open, nonlinear, a capitalist economy has more in common with an ecosystem than with the mechanistic systems on which the neoclassicists modeled their theory. And this view suggests that like an ecosystem, markets are evolutionary systems that each day carry out millions of simultaneous experiments on how to make our lives better. The implications of this emerging view are just only beginning to be explored, but I believe it has fundamental implications for how people think about the nature of capitalism and prosperity. Significantly, this view identifies the essential role of capitalism not as allocation, but as invention, as creation. Think about it. Life isn't drastically better today than it was in 1800 because we are allocating 19th century economic resources more efficiently. Rather, it is better because we have created life-saving antibiotics, indoor plumbing, motorized transport, et cetera, and all of which have become available to much, if not all, of the world's population. The genius of capitalism is that it creates incentives both for solving human problems and for making those solutions widely available. And it is the accumulation of solutions to human problems that ultimately defines prosperity, not the accumulation of money. Most of us intuitively believe that the more money people have, the more prosperous society must be. But the idea that prosperity is money is simply about having money can be easily disproved with a simple thought experiment. Imagine you were king or queen of the jungle with a pile of money in the form of beads as high as a house. But all that money wouldn't buy you antibiotics or air conditioning or a comfy bed. Yet even the poorest Americans have access to these crucial elements of well-being. Or if you prefer a thought experiment closer to home, who do you think would be healthier, happier, and live a longer life? An average 21st century American or the wealthiest of our 18th century founding fathers? On an inflation-adjusted basis, these were wealthy folks, but there is simply no doubt that their lives were shorter, sicker, dirtier, colder or hotter, and lousier. Prosperity and money simply are not the same thing. Money is simply a medium of exchange and a store of value. Properly understood, the prosperity of a society should be measured by the accumulation of solutions to human problems, not the accumulation of monetary wealth. These solutions can run from the prosaic, like a crunchier potato chip, to the profound, like a cure for a deadly disease. Every item in a modern retail store can be thought of as a solution to a different kind of problem: how to eat, dress, entertain, decorate our homes, etc. The more and better the solutions available to us, the more prosperity we have. And the more broadly a society makes those solutions available to its people, the more prosperous that society is. So if prosperity is measured by our ability to solve human problems, how do we measure economic growth? We typically talk about growth in terms of money, gross domestic product, or GDP, essentially the sum of the monetary value of economic activity. There have been a variety of attempts to make GDP account for things such as environmental damage, unpaid work, the progress of technology, or the development of human capital, but at the core, GDP is a monetary measure of output. In my view, the bigger problem with GDP is not that it doesn't accurately measure economic growth, but that it doesn't necessarily reflect how growth changes the real lived experience of the typical family. In the United States, for example, GDP has more than tripled over the last 3 decades. I didn't bring slides, but if I had, I could show you a chart of GDP that looks like this. It is a very happy picture. But is the lived experience of the typical family improving in the same way? Would a chart of their experience reflect GDP? And the answer is absolutely not. Most people have experienced the last several decades like this or like this. And that is because 3 decades ago, the median wage decoupled from GDP and productivity gains. The difference between these two realities, the difference between GDP versus lived experience, is the difference between output and outcomes. If the concept of growth is to have significance and relevance in people's lives, it should represent outcomes, real improvement in people's lives. If the real measure of a society's prosperity is the availability of solutions to human problems, growth cannot simply be measured by changes in GDP. Rather, it must be a measure of the rate at which new solutions to human problems are created. Going from fearing death from a sinus infection one day to having access to life-saving antibiotics the next, that is growth. Going from sweltering in the heat on one day to living with air conditioning the next, that is growth. Going from needing to look up basic information in a library to having all of the world's information available to you instantaneously on your phone, that is growth. Growth is best thought of as an increase in both the quality and distribution of solutions to human problems. For example, take the smartphone. It is a problem-solving machine. When you download a new app, what you're actually loading onto your phone is a new solution. The reason we cannot seem to live without these things anymore is that they are literally the most powerful problem-solving tool in the history of humanity. Problems, of course, differ in importance, and a new view of growth must take this into account. For example, finding a cure to cancer is better and more important than other product innovations, but only if this cure is available to many people. In general, economic growth is the actual experience of having our lives improved. One implication of this view is that in an economy that concentrates wealth at the top will only provide incentives for capitalists to solve the problems of the rich. And we are rapidly becoming an economy that bifurcates in this way. Many of the big retail companies and others that used to serve the middle class are in sharp decline. Can the rate at which solutions appear and are made available be measured? While such a measure has not been tried, I believe it is possible. Inflation is measured by looking at changes in the prices in goods and services in a basket, typically consumed by households. Similarly, it's possible to look at how the actual contents of such a basket are changing across time and how they differ across countries or levels of income. Outcomes are usually harder to measure than output, but by redefining economic growth from a measure of monetary value to a measure of available solutions, we inevitably redefine capitalism itself. If prosperity is created solving human problems, the central question for a society then is what kind of economic system will solve the most problems for the most people the most quickly? And this is the genius of capitalism. It is an unmatched evolutionary system for finding solutions to human problems. The genius of capitalism is that it rewards people for solving other people's problems. The orthodox view, on the other hand, is that capitalism creates value by efficiently allocating existing resources. This is simply not true. The essential role of capitalism is not allocation, it's creation. The orthodox view is that market economies are efficient. They are not. On the contrary, just like all evolutionary systems, like in nature, they are extraordinarily wasteful. 80% of all companies fail within 18 months of founding. Waste in market economies is everywhere. Capitalism works by effectively creating new solutions to human problems. Capitalist economies are effective if well managed. The implications of that difference, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, are profound and can lead us to a new and much better explanation for how capitalist economies create growth and thus what policies are optimal. Because an economy is a type of ecosystem, markets are evolutionary systems that each day carry out millions of simultaneous experiments on how to make our lives better. The economy evolves like a natural ecosystem, and companies are the evolving organisms within it. At this very moment, around the world, millions of teams of people are working hard to provide us with better medicines, more attractive clothes, tastier food, a smartphone with better features, and other things that make our material standard of living better. You can think of these millions of competing solutions as equivalent to genetic diversity. And just like in a natural ecosystem, the most adaptive solutions ultimately prevail. As I said before, life isn't drastically better for billions of people today than it was in 1800 because we are allocating the resources of the 19th century economy more efficiently. If so, we'd all be drowning in buggy whips. Rather, it is because we have life-saving antibiotics, indoor plumbing, motorized transport, etc. The genius of capitalism is that it both creates incentives for solving human problems and for making those solutions widely available. Not only does capitalism create incentives for people to pour their creative energies into solving other people's problems, it does so in a way that facilitates trade, specialization, and cooperation on a massive scale. When you buy a car, you're at the end of an incredibly complex supply chain involving specialized knowledge and abilities that stretches across dozens of countries, hundreds of companies, thousands or millions of people, few of whom have ever met each other, yet all of whom work together in a complex web of cooperation that enables you to drive off the lot. The foundation of prosperity in human societies is cooperation leading to trade. Market capitalism creates trade, and trade in turn creates specialization. Trade allows people to specialize, and specialization, breaking problems up into finer and finer subproblems, is truly the source of all new knowledge. The more trade we have, the more specialization we have, the more new knowledge societies create. Societies where people are self-sufficient, by the way, are always poor. That's because there is a very clear upward boundary to what one person can know. No one can ever know how to build this phone. It takes the specialized, disaggregated knowledge of thousands of people to build this phone. And technology, the foundation of all new solutions to human problems, is a consequence of using and rearranging specialized knowledge in novel ways. Technology, innovation, invention is taking specialized knowledge and mixing it together in new ways to create a new solution to a human problem. But all of the dynamics that enable this evolutionary and algorithmic process depend on and scale with participation, on inclusion. This is obvious when you think about it. The more people trade, the more people who can specialize. The more people who can harness the specialization to become entrepreneurs and inventors, the more problems we solve. The more customers those entrepreneurs have, the faster the virtuous cycle goes and the more prosperity we create. And naturally, the more diverse the participants and their approaches to problem solving, the more dynamic and robust the system and the more quickly difficult problems are surmounted. Seen in this way, growth is the consequence of a feedback loop between the increasing numbers of innovators who create new solutions to human problems and the consumers who create increasing demand that supports and sustains that innovation. This makes clear that the central driver or mechanism of growth is inclusion. the degree to which we maximize the number of robust participants in this feedback loop. And if this is true, then the explicit goal of our economic policies must be to maximize the number of diverse and able innovators and customers in our economy. This is the most fundamental point I want to make today, and the one that defines the essence of a 21st century theory of growth. The orthodox view, on the other hand, is that if we have growth, we should try to include people in it for moral reasons. What I am claiming is that this view is wrong and backwards. I am claiming that moral issues aside, inclusion is the fundamental mechanism that creates growth in capitalist economies. Orthodox trickle-down theory holds that a thriving middle class is the consequence of growth. If we make rich people richer and less constrained by regulation, that prosperity will trickle down to the middle class and the poor. This is wrong. A thriving middle class is the source of prosperity in capitalist economies. Prosperity does not trickle down from the top. It is always built from the middle out. And this is what we mean when we say, by the way, middle out economics, and why policies focused on middle class that maximize the number of people included in the economy in every way, that harness the full potential of every citizen, whether they be seller or buyer or both, are the only policies that ever lead to true growth. But maximizing participation, not just at the top, but from the middle out, it requires effort and investment. It does not happen magically by itself, which is why every prosperous capitalist economy on Earth is characterized by both high rates of investment in its middle class and the infrastructure they depend on, and equally, the progressive taxation and labor standards necessary to fund those investments. And this is why, moral issues aside, inequality is so toxic to growth. High levels of inequality exclude people as innovators and as customers, diminishing both innovation and demand. But a more reasonable distribution of income, along with a tax system adequate to make key investments in education and R&D and transportation and so forth, both includes and enfranchises people. This is why policies like raising the minimum wage, for instance, increase growth. They help include more people in the economy. The central argument of trickle-down economics is that it is the wealth of the wealthy and the profits of corporations, the accumulated concentration of capital, that is the source of growth. 200 years ago, this was also untrue, but at least it was plausible. Today, in our 21st century, in the 21st century, it is innovation and inclusion that are the primary sources of growth and the most meaningful measure of prosperity. Trickle-down theory inherently argues that all taxes on profits and wealth necessarily kill growth. Our 21st century theory recognizes that profits and wealth are merely the byproduct of growth, and that taxes sufficient to invest in inclusionary programs like education and transportation are absolutely necessary to create the economic growth from which we all prosper. For the past 40 years, trickle-down orthodoxy has shaped and guided our nation's economic policies, and these policies have failed because these old theories fail to describe the real economy. They describe an imaginary economy. The real economy grows from the middle out, not the top down. The contrast between our contemporary theory of growth and the old failed theory are clear. It is a contrast between creation versus allocation, effectiveness versus efficiency, outcomes versus output, and inclusion versus exclusion. It is a contrast between an increasing returns world of sellers and buyers versus the old zero-sum world of makers and takers. There are many policy implications of this new theory of growth, and I don't have the time to explore them now. But I am the guest today of a public university, so I will share just one. If the trickle-down growth of theory is correct, then investments in public education and higher education are merely a luxury to be afforded only if and when we have growth. But if our 21st century definition of growth is correct, that growth comes from inclusion, then investments in public education of every kind are an absolute prerequisite for growth in a modern capitalist economy. The difference in those perspectives is vast. I have to presume that many of you doubt all this. It could not be otherwise. We have been sold the trickle-down tale for all of our lives. We have to remember that these same arguments are as old as civilization. We used to call it divine right. Now we have trickle-down economics. And to be sure, no amount of evidence will ever persuade all of the wealthy and powerful to abandon the self-interest that lies at the center of the trickle-down worldview. That we deserve what we have, and you deserve what you have. That the better we do, the better it will be for you. That we matter, and you don't. But consider this fact, that throughout the history of capitalism, the most democratic nations have also proven to be the most prosperous. And anywhere you find exclusionary, autocratic government, you find poverty. Democracy isn't just correlated with prosperity. It is its cause, because democracy is the most inclusive form of government ever created. And the more inclusive a society is, the more diverse, vibrant, and resourceful its economy. It is this fundamental connection between political inclusion and economic inclusion that I believe our founding fathers understood when proclaiming our inalienable rights. Neoclassical economists, and trickle-down policymakers would have you believe that our current economy is based on economic principles as immutable as physical laws. It is not. Societies are social and moral constructions. Economics is how we encode and enforce our moral and social preferences about status and power. The great thing about democracy is that we have the power to make wise choices about that. We Americans treasure democracy and the freedom it brings, and freedom is core to human happiness. But it's worth considering the possibility that democracy's greatest gift may be inclusion, which is the foundational mechanism of all prosperity. Thank you.